Good morning. This is Professor Adolfo Arevalo, and again, we are now on our new topic, specifically the topic on the simultaneous change in demand and supply and the change in equilibrium condition. In our previous lesson, we have learned of the relationship between the change in demand and price equilibrium, change in demand and quantity equilibrium. We also have tackled the relationship between the change in supply and price equilibrium and change in supply and quantity equilibrium. Specifically, we have established that the relationship between the change in demand and price equilibrium are directly related. The change in demand and quantity equilibrium are also directly related. The change in supply and quantity equilibrium are also directly related. But what is inverse in relationship are the change in supply and price equilibrium. In this particular lesson, we have to focus on the simultaneous change between demand and supply. The fact that both the demand and supply increase, there will of course be corresponding change in equilibrium condition, so that price equilibrium will change and quantity equilibrium will also change. Now, in our specific lesson today, we will examine the effect to price and quantity equilibrium when the change in demand exceeds the change in supply. So let us now consider the relationship. We have this particular situation that the change in demand exceeds the change in supply. So if we look at the market forces, the law of demand is dominant than the law of supply. Specifically, the force between the demand and the supply is not balanced, so that given the two forces between the demand and the supply, it is the force of demand that dominates in the market. So specifically, if we know the relationship between the demand and supply, we know that if the price of the commodity increases, the quantity demanded of the commodity decreases, and vice versa. But here we are not anymore talking about just the price, or the behavior of the particular buyer in the market. We're talking already about what will happen to the prevailing price of the commodity in the market, given that there is a change in both the demand and the supply. The fact that we have learned last time of the relationship between the change in demand to the equilibrium condition, and considering that the change in demand in this particular situation is greater than the change in supply, which of these two forces will have the greater influence to price and quantity equilibrium? Of course, the demand, which has a higher influence, will have an effect to the change in price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium. So specifically, let us state this relationship. Given that the change in demand exceeds the change in supply, the price and quantity equilibrium are directly related to the change in demand. What does that mean? Suppose that there is an increase, or there is increase in both the demand and supply, but the increase in demand is greater than the increase in supply. What will happen to price equilibrium, or what will happen to quantity equilibrium? Let us now going to explore this market situation in the next slide. In this particular presentation, we have to consider a situation that the increase in demand exceeds the increase in supply. And let us state the particular market problem. The original demand and supply equations are QD equal to 72.5 minus 12.5P, and QS is equal to negative 25 plus 15P, respectively. Solve for the new price and quantity equilibrium, given that after a time period, there exists a simultaneous increase in demand by 10 units and increase in supply by 5 units. So, how are we going to deal with this problem? First is that we have to recognize the original demand equation and the original supply equation. Second is to recognize how much change in demand and how there is, and how much change in supply there is. So in this particular problem, the change in demand is specifically an increase in demand by 10 units. And the change in supply is specifically an increase in supply by 5 units. Now, after recognizing the original demand and supply equations and the increases in demand and supply, we can now be able to derive the new demand and supply equations. Let us first deal with the new demand equation. So, the new demand equation can be derived by adding the change in demand to the original demand equation. And given that the original equation is 72.5 minus 12.5p, if we add to it the change in demand, which is an increase by 10%, or rather 10 units, then we now have a new demand equation to equal to QD sub 1 plus 10. And because QD sub 1 is 72.5 minus 12.5p plus 10, then we can now have QD sub 2 equal to 82.5 minus 12.5p. So now we have the new demand equation of 82.5 minus 12.5p. Now what about the new supply equation? So just the same way we have derived the new demand equation, we can also derive the new supply equation by adding the change in supply to the original supply equation. That is, the original supply equation is given by negative 25 plus 15p. And the change in supply is an increase in supply by 5 units. Therefore, the change in the new supply equation can now be stated as equal to QS sub 1 plus 5. Specifically, QS sub 2 is equal to negative 25 plus 15p plus 5. And thus the QS sub 2, which is the new supply equation, is now equal to negative 20 plus 15P. So we have now the new demand equation and new supply equation. And we also have to recognize the original demand equation and the original supply equations. Now, mathematically, we can be able to derive the price equilibrium and the quantity equilibrium, original and new. So that if we are going to compute for the original price equilibrium, the original price equilibrium can be solved by equating the original supply equation to the original demand equation. Thus, negative 25 plus 15P is equal to 72.5 minus 12.5P. And solving for the unknown variable P, we have to bring all those terms with P to the right side of the equality sign and the whole values to the right side of the equality sign. I repeat, in solving for P, let us bring those terms with P to the left side of the equality sign and bring all the whole values to the right side of the equality sign. Thus, we now have 15P plus 12.5P is equal to 72.5 plus 25. And we can now add the coefficient of P. 15 plus 12.5 is 27.5. And we can also add the whole values, which is 72.5 plus 25. Notice that the 25 is now positive, when in fact it was negative at the left side of the equality sign. That's the rule of transposition. We have to change the sign as the value is being transposed from one equality side to another equality side. Okay, so we now have 27.5 as the coefficient of P, which is equal to 97.5. Solving for P now, we have 97.5 divided by 27.5. And therefore, the quotient of P is now 3.54 pesos. And this is now our original price equilibrium. Now, to solve for the new price equilibrium, what we have to equate are the new supply equation and the new demand equation. So, the new supply equation is given by negative 20 plus 15P, and the new demand equation is given by 82.5 minus 12.5P. So, equating them, we have negative 20 plus 15P is equal to 82.5 minus 12.5P. And bringing now all those terms with P to the left side of the equality sign, and the whole numbers to the right side of the equality sign, we have now 15P plus 12.5P equals to 82.5 plus 20. And to add the coefficient of P, we have 27.5P. And to add the whole numbers, we have 102.5. So, solving for P now, we have P is equal to 102.5 divided by 27.5, and the quotient will therefore be equal to 3.73, which serves as the value of the new price equilibrium. So we already have the original price equilibrium and the new price equilibrium. Again, to solve for the original price equilibrium, we have to equate the original supply equation to the original demand equation. And to solve for the new price equilibrium, we have to equate the new supply equation to the new demand equation. So now that we already have the original and the new price equilibrium values, we can be able to determine the change in price equilibrium. And the change in price equilibrium can only be solved by getting the difference between the new and the original price equilibrium values. So specifically, the change in price equilibrium is equal to the new price equilibrium minus the original price equilibrium. So P sub 2 minus P sub 1. Now, since the new price equilibrium is given by the value 3.73 and the original price equilibrium is given by the value of 3.54, we can now solve for the change in price equilibrium as 3.73 minus 3.54. And this will give us a difference of 0.19 centavos. And the sign is positive. Positive means increase. So that is, the price equilibrium increased by 19 centavos. So again, because of the increase in both the demand and supply, and given that the increase in demand is greater than the increase in supply, there will be an increase in price equilibrium. So price equilibrium increased because of the increase in quantity, or rather increase in demand. And they are directly related. Price equilibrium increased, and there is also because there is also increase in supply, but it is not the increase in supply that caused the increase in price equilibrium, but it was actually the increase in demand, since the change in demand exceeds the change in supply. So the force of demand is greater than the force of supply. So the resultant is that price equilibrium will be influenced more by the change in demand rather than being influenced by the change in supply. Graphically speaking, notice that the gap between the new demand and the original demand is greater, as depicted by a greater distance or a greater gap between QD1 and QD2. But the gap between QS1 and QS2 is very small. So that is to indicate that the bigger gap between QD1 and QD2 specifies the greater change in demand, and the smaller change in supply is specified by a smaller gap or distance between QS1 and QS2 curves. So notice the graphical illustrations between the original and the new demand curve, and compare it to the distance between the original and the new supply curves. So the gap between the demand curves is bigger than the gap between the supply curves. And this will graphically explain that the change in demand is greater than the change in supply. Notice also as to where we can find the original equilibrium point. The original equilibrium point can be observed between the intersection of the original supply and the original demand curve. So at that point of intersection between the original demand curve and the original supply curve is a quantity equilibrium of 28.25 and a price equilibrium of 3.54. Between the new demand, or at the intersection, at the point of intersection between the new demand curve and the new supply curve is a corresponding price equilibrium of 3.73 and quantity equilibrium of 35.88. But so far we have not explored yet on how quantity equilibrium original and quantity equilibrium new are solved. In the following slide, we will be showing the way the new and the old, or the new and the original quantity equilibrium can be computed. So let us now proceed to the next slide, showing to you the computation of the original quantity equilibrium and the new quantity equilibrium. So using the same problem and using the same graph or market situation based from the same problem stated above, we can now be able to solve for the original quantity equilibrium. And to solve for the original quantity equilibrium, we have to use the original demand equation as our reference equation. So the original demand equation is 72.5 minus 12.5p. In order to solve for the original quantity equilibrium, we have to substitute the value of the original price equilibrium to P of the original demand equation. Thus, we now have 72.5 minus 12.5p times the price equilibrium original. And since the price equilibrium original is 3.54, therefore we have now 72.5 minus 12.5 times 3.54. To simplify, this will bring us to the value of 28.25. And 28.25 is now our original quantity equilibrium. Now what about the new quantity equilibrium? We can solve for the new quantity equilibrium by using the new demand equation and the new price equilibrium values. Since the new demand equation is given by 82.5 minus 12.5p, and the new price equilibrium is 3.73, by substituting the new price equilibrium to P of the new demand equation, we can now have 82.5 minus 12.5 times 3.73. And to simplify, it will give us a value of 35.88. So 35.88 serves now as the value of our new quantity equilibrium. Now we can be able to compute for the change in quantity equilibrium. And the change in quantity equilibrium can be solved by just getting the difference between the new quantity equilibrium and the original quantity equilibrium. That is, QE sub 2 minus QE sub 1. QE sub 2 is the new quantity equilibrium, and QE sub 1 is the original quantity equilibrium. So QE sub 2 of 35.88 minus QE sub 1 of 28.25 will now give us a value of 7.63 units. 7.63 units is positive. Positive means that there is an increase in quantity equilibrium by 7.63 units. So, because of the simultaneous increase in demand by 10 units and increase in supply by 5 units, quantity equilibrium increased by 7.63 units. So notice that graphically we have already illustrated these quantity equilibrium values. The original value was 28.25 and the new value is now 35.88. So that there is now an increase in quantity equilibrium from 28.25 to 35.88, and the amount of increase in quantity equilibrium is 7.64 units. So, to summarize, given that the increase in demand exceeds the increase in supply, both the price and quantity equilibrium increase. And so far, the amount of increase in price equilibrium is 19 centavos, and the amount of increase in quantity equilibrium is 7.63 units. Now let us go to the next market condition. And this time, we're going to consider the situation that increase in demand exceeds the decrease in supply. So earlier, in our previous slide, both demand and supply increased. But here, demand increased, but the supply decreased. And the increase in demand is greater than the decrease in supply. Let us read this particular market situation given by a specific market problem. The original demand and supply equations are QD equal to 72.5 minus 12.5P and QS is equal to negative 25 plus 15P respectively. Solve for the new price and quantity equilibrium given that after a time period there exists a simultaneous increase in demand by 10 units and decrease in supply by 5 units. So the increase in demand is 10 units and the decrease in supply is 7 units as specified in this problem. So take note, class, that if we compare 10 to 7, 10 is greater than 7. So thus, the amount of change in demand is greater than the amount of change in supply. And it is the force of demand that is influencing more of the price and quantity equilibrium in the market than the force of supply. So we can now begin to analyze this particular market condition by deriving the new demand equation and the new supply equations from their given original demand equations and original supply equations. So let us first refer to the derivation of the new demand equation. So we can derive the new demand equation again by adding the change in demand from the original demand equation. And since the original demand equation is 72.5 minus 12.5P, and the change in supply is an increase in supply by 10, so we have introduced plus 10. Therefore, QD sub 1 plus 10 is equal to QD sub 2. Again, QD sub 2 is QD sub 1 plus 10. So 72.5 minus 12.5p plus 10, to simplify, will equal to 82.5 minus 12.5p, which is the new demand equation. So the new demand equation now is QD sub 2 equals 82.5 minus 12.5p. Now let us go to the next step, and that is to derive the new supply equation. To derive the new supply equation, once again, we have to add the change in supply from the original supply equation. Since the original supply equation is given by negative 25 plus 15p, and the change in supply is a decrease by 7 units, so we have to introduce negative 7 to represent the change in supply. Negative because of the decrease. So we can now have the equation QS of 2 is equal to QS of 1 minus 7. And therefore, negative 25 plus 15p, which is the QS of 1, minus 7, if to be simplified, will equal to negative 32 plus 15p. And this serves as the new supply equation. So the new supply equation now is QS of 2 equals negative 32 plus 15p. So now that we have the original demand and supply equations, or new demand and supply equations, we can now be able to solve for the original price equilibrium and the original quantity, or rather the new price equilibrium. So just the same as what we have done earlier, the original price equilibrium is computed by equating the original supply equation to the original demand equation. And since we already have solved this in the previous slide, which gave us the value of 3.54 as the value of price equilibrium original, we can now proceed to solving for the new price equilibrium. And the new price equilibrium can be solved by equating the new supply equation to the new demand equation. That is, QS of 2 equals to QD sub 2. And QS of 2, which is the new supply equation, is given by negative 32 plus 15p, while QS of 2, which is the new demand equation, is given by 82.5 minus 12.5p. So equating the two, we now have minus 32 plus 15p is equal to 82.5 minus 12.5p. Bringing those terms with p to the right side of the equality sign and the whole numbers to the left, bringing all those terms to the left side of the equality sign and the whole numbers to the right side of the equality sign, we now have 15p plus 12.5p is equal to 82.5 plus 32. And solving for p now, we can have 114.5 divided by 27.5. So the quotient now of 4.16 represents the value of the new price equilibrium. So here we have a new price equilibrium of 4.16, and the original price equilibrium is 3.54. So to get the difference between the new and the original price equilibrium values, we now have 0.62 pesos, which means the change in price equilibrium is about 62 centavos. And this is an increase in price equilibrium because of a positive sign. Positive because the new price equilibrium is greater than the original price equilibrium. And So there is an increase in price equilibrium. And this is because of the influence of demand rather than of supply, because the influence of demand in the market is far greater than the influence of supply in the market. So demand has more influence to the direction of the price equilibrium. The fact that there is an increase in demand, the price equilibrium will also increase. Now, in the next slide is simply just the computation of the quantity equilibrium original and quantity equilibrium new from these same problems that we are presenting now. So let us try to see as to how the quantity equilibrium new is to be solved. We already have so far computed for the original quantity equilibrium in the last slides, because we are dealing with the same values of or same equations of original demand and original supply equation. So we will also have the same original quantity equilibrium as what was previously computed in the earlier slide. So our problem now is to solve for the new quantity equilibrium. So we can solve the new quantity equilibrium by using the original demand equation as our reference, and substitute to its P variable the new price equilibrium of 4.16. So after substituting the new price equilibrium of 4.16 to the new demand equation, we can now derive the new quantity equilibrium value. So that is 82.5 minus 12.5 P can now be used. And if the new price equilibrium is to be substituted to the P of that equation, then we can now simplify our quantity equilibrium as 82.5 minus 52. And therefore, the difference of 30.5 is the value of new quantity equilibrium. Now, how are we going to compute for the change in quantity equilibrium? So the change in quantity equilibrium is simply just the difference between QE sub 2 minus QE sub 1. QE sub 2 being the new quantity equilibrium, QE sub 1 being the original quantity equilibrium. So 30.5 minus 28.5 will result to a value of 2 units, which is the change in quantity equilibrium. And so notice of the positive sign. Positive means increase. So there is an increase in quantity equilibrium by 2 units because of the simultaneous increase in demand by 10 units and decrease in supply by 7 units. Now let us also consider another market situation. In this particular market situation, we will illustrate that the decrease in demand exceeds the decrease in supply. In the earlier slides, it was more about increase in demand being exceeding the change in supply. Here, we will refer to decrease in demand to exceed the change in supply, specifically decrease in supply. So both the demand and the supply decrease. Let us read the statement. problem statement. The original demand and supply equations are QD equal to 72.5 minus 12.5P and QS is equal to negative 25 plus 15P respectively. Solve for the new price and quantity equilibrium given that after a time period there exists a simultaneous decrease in demand by 17 units and decrease in supply by 19 units. So both demand and supply decreased. The demand decreased by 70 units while the supply decreased by 9 units. So given their original equations, we can be able to derive the new demand equation and the new supply equation. So let us first refer to the derivation of the new demand equation. To derive a new demand equation, we have to add a change in demand from the original demand equation. So we have negative 70 as the value of change in demand because there is a decrease in demand by 17 units. And since the original demand equation is given by 72.5 minus 12.5P, so we can now have the new demand equation as equal to 72.5 minus 12.5P minus 17. And to simplify, we can now have 55.5 minus 12.5P as the new demand equation. Now let us go to the derivation of the new supply equation. Yes. So just the same, we add the change in supply from the original supply equation. And the fact that there is a decrease in supply by 9 units, so the change in supply is actually negative 9. Now, adding this to the original supply equation, we can now have the equation negative 25 plus 15P minus 9. And to simplify, we have now QS of 2 equals negative 34 plus 15P. So take note of the new supply equation given by the equation QS of 2 is equal to negative 34 plus 15P. So now we are ready to solve for the price equilibrium, but because the original demand and supply equations are given in this particular problem are the same equations in the previous slides. So the price equilibrium original can now still be equivalent to 3.54 since we use the same equations as we have done in the previous slides. So the new price equilibrium now can be derived by equating the new supply equation to the new demand equation. And the new supply equation is given by negative 34 plus 15P. And the new demand equation is 55.5 minus 12.5P. So that equating them, we have negative 34 plus 15P is equal to 55.5 minus 12.5P. Solving for P, we have to bring all those terms with P to the left side of the equality sign and the whole values to the right side of the equality sign. So that we now have 15P plus 12.5P is equal to 55.5 plus 34. And to add the coefficients of P, we now have 27.5P is equal to 89.5. And to solve for P now, we have 89.5 divided by 27.5. So the quotient of 3.25 serves as the value of our new price equilibrium. And the fact that we now have the new and the original price equilibrium values, we can now compute for the change in price equilibrium. And the change in price equilibrium is P E sub 2 minus P E sub 1. P E sub 2 is the original price, the new price equilibrium rather, and P E sub 1 is the original price equilibrium. So that 3.25 minus 3.54 is now equal to negative 0.25, 29 rather, negative 0.29. So take note of the negative side. Negative means decrease. So there is a decrease by 29 centavos in the prices of this, in the price of these goods and services after a simultaneous change in demand and supply. So using the same market situation and market condition, but by the way, graphically you will observe that the gap between the new and the original demand curve is bigger than the gap between the new and the original supply curves. That is because the change in demand exceeds the change in supply. So using the same situation, in the next slide, we can be able to solve for the value of the new quantity equilibrium. So since we use the same original demand and supply equation, so the original quantity equilibrium can be computed the same way as how we have computed it in the earlier slides. So the new quantity equilibrium now can be solved by using the new demand equation as our reference and substituting to it the value of new price equilibrium to the P of the new demand equation, so that we now have 55 minus, rather 55.5 minus 12.5 P times 3.25 is equal to the new quantity equilibrium. So 55.5 minus 40.62. 40.62 was derived from the product of 12.5 and 3.25. So the new quantity equilibrium now is equal to 14.88. And so the fact that we now have the value of new quantity equilibrium and the original quantity equilibrium of 28.25, we can now compute for the change in quantity equilibrium. The change in quantity equilibrium is Q is of 2 minus Q is of 1. So we now have 14.88, the value of the new quantity equilibrium, minus 28.5, the value of the original quantity equilibrium. So it gives us a difference of negative 13.62 units. The fact that it is negative, it means that there is a decrease in quantity equilibrium. And the decrease in quantity equilibrium is 13.62 units. So because of the decrease in both the demand and supply, there will also be a decrease in quantity equilibrium, and specifically the decrease is 13.62 units. So we can go to the next market situation. Now, what about in this particular market situation? In this particular market condition, we are to illustrate a market condition that the decrease in demand exceeds the increase in supply. So there is an opposite movement in demand and supply. The demand shifted to the left because of decrease in supply. The demand curve shifted to the left because of the decrease in supply, while the supply curve shifted to the right because of the increase in supply. Graphically, you will notice here that just again the same way, because the change in demand exceeds the change in supply, so the gap between the new and the original demand curve is bigger than the gap between the new and the original supply curves. But let us consider the specific problem that illustrates this particular market condition. The original demand and supply equations are QD equal to 72.5 minus 12.5P and QS is equal to negative 25 plus 15P respectively. Solve for the new price and quantity equilibrium given that after a time period there exists a simultaneous decrease in demand by 20 units and increase in supply by 10 units. Now, since we already have dealt with a lot of problems in the earlier slides, we can now be able to derive the new demand equation and the new supply equations using the same procedure as what we have done in the previous slides. So the new demand equation is 72.5 minus 12.5, and this time the original demand equation is 72.5 minus 12.5P, and now the new demand equation is QD sub 2 equals to 52.5 minus 12.5P. So take note that we just added the change in demand to the original demand equation, and the fact that there is a decrease in demand, so a negative 20 is introduced as being the value to be subtracted from the original demand equation. And so QD sub 2 now can be derived as 52.5 minus 12.5P. So that's the same way we will do for deriving the new supply equation. The change in supply is increased by 10, so we introduce plus 10 from the original supply equation. And therefore, we now have the simplified equation of negative 15 plus 15P, which serves as the new supply equation. So same with how we have computed the original price equilibrium. We equate the original supply equation to the original demand equation, and then solve for the unknown variable P. And the unknown variable P is 3.54, which is the original price equilibrium. For the new price equilibrium, we equate the new supply equation to the new demand equation. And by simplifying, we can now have a value of 2.45, which represents the value of P and already served as the value of the new price equilibrium. So now that we have the new price equilibrium and the original price equilibrium, by getting the difference between the new and the original price equilibrium, the original price equilibrium being subtracted from the new price equilibrium, we now have 2.45 minus 3.54, and it gives us a difference of 1.09, which is negative, and negative means decrease. So there is a decrease in price equilibrium by 1.09 pesos, and this is because of a greater influence of decrease in demand. So the next slide will just give us how the new quantity equilibrium can be computed. And just the same, by computing the quantity equilibrium, we use the original demand equation for computing the original quantity equilibrium, and we use the new demand equation for computing the new quantity equilibrium. So what we will do is just to substitute the price equilibrium to the P of the equations, of the demand equations to solve for the quantity equilibrium. Okay. So we have now a new quantity equilibrium of 21.88, and this was derived from substituting the new price equilibrium of 2.45 to the P equation of the new demand equation. And the new demand equation is given by the equation 52.5 minus 12.5 P. Now that we have substituted the value of the new price equilibrium to the P of this equation, we can now have a simplified, we can now simplify this to a value of 52.5 minus 30.62, and therefore the new quantity equilibrium now is positive 21.88, and positive means